Oh, here. Well, I don't know. Squeeze these, start. Push this forward. And you're good.
Hello? Hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, our speaker tonight is Megan Donovan. She works in the legal and nonprofit fields, and she facilitates groups at the Norma Hare Women's Center at 22nd and Payne. And she's chair of our advocacy committee and a member of the Cleveland Peace Action Board. And she's going to be speaking of war as a feminist issue. Peace.
Yeah, why peace is a feminist.
Why peace is a feminist issue. Sorry, I got that messed up. All right. After she speaks tonight, I'm hoping that people will be feeling compelled to go to take part in the Women's March on Saturday, which we are helping to co-sponsor. And I think, Don, you have information on, it meets at 11 o'clock?
10:30 I thought it started.
Okay,
So,
10:30
yeah.
at Market Square, which is across the street.
No.
No?
City Hall.
City
Women's
Hall?
March is City Hall, yeah.
Okay, well, what's
Yeah.
the Market Square?
That's
That's the 25th?
Yeah, 25th is Market Square.
Okay.
Sorry.
Don?
Oh,
Don is our person who's in charge of all our demonstrations. So we'll let him tell you about the Women's March and then the 25th.
Okay, good evening, thanks for coming out. So the 18th of this Saturday is the Women's March, and Cleveland Peace Action is co-sponsoring among many other organizations. And that will be at the City Hall, Cleveland City Hall, 601 Lakeside, at 10:30 to 12:30, something along those lines. Now on the 25th, there's flyers on the table. Another peace rally, no war in Iran, troops out of Iraq, U.S. troops out, no war in Iran. So that's at Market Square at 1 p.m. on the 25th. And that's a nationally organized rally. So we're having a local one. Thank you.
Okay, so Megan?
all right. Can y'all hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. I'll start with the disclaimer that I'm not an expert. I'm sure some of you will ask questions that I will do my best to answer, but I'm sure there are people in the audience more knowledgeable than I am. I'm just someone who's very serious about peace and about feminism. I'm the wife, daughter, and granddaughter of veterans, and I see the effects that war has on people, so I'm very committed to the peace movement. So there are many reasons why peace is a feminist issue, and women have a very complicated relationship to war. Carol Kahn, who is the founding director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, and a lecturer of women's studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, writes, "The starting point for thinking about women in wars must be that women's experiences of war are extremely diverse. Women both try to prevent wars and instigate wars. Women are raped, tortured, maimed, and murdered. They are widowed. The children they have nurtured are lost to violence. But women are also members and supporters of the militaries and armed groups that commit these acts. Women stay home resolutely striving to maintain family and community relationships, and women are displaced, living in camps without any of the structures that they have built to make life possible. Women are empowered by taking on new roles in wartime, and disempowered by being abducted from their homes and forced into armed groups or military prostitution. When the war is over, women work to rebuild their communities, and women are ejected from their families and communities because they have been raped or been combatants or lost a limb to a landmine." War is typically coded as masculine, as something that involves doing, power, and all the things that we associate with being manly, and peace is typically coded as feminine, and all the things that we associate with being womanly. And this misogyny, unfortunately, leads to the fact that security studies, that is war studies, typically has a higher status and far more resources than peace studies do. Also, nationalist ideologies symbolize nations as women who must be protected, specifically by male soldiers. One of the most obvious effects of war is that war creates widows. Robin Lee Riley, who is the author of Depicting the Veiled Transnational Sexism in the War on Terror, cites statistics that an estimated 2 million women in Afghanistan and an estimated 1.5 million women in Iraq are widows. And this is as a result of the years of conflict and sanctions. Maria Akrami, who is a social worker for an NGO based in Kabul, says, if America invaded us to liberate our women, this is a clear sign that they are failing miserably. And Hamida Ayed, a widow in Iraq, told the author, our life has been turned into misery and desperation. This is what we got from occupation and the dreams of democracy. Orphans, widows, homeless, displaced, and fugitives. War also creates refugees. Winona Giles, who is professor emerita at the Department of Anthropology at York University, and also the creator of the Borderless Higher Education for Refugees project, writes, displaced women is not just a descriptor. Instead, it is a label that becomes an identity in the eyes of others. At the end of 2018, some 41.3 million people were internally displaced due to armed conflict, generalized violence, and human rights violations. As many as 80% of them are women and children. Another 25.9 million are refugees, more than half of whom are under 18 and about half of whom are female. So there are a lot of women and girls who are displaced in one way or another. Dr. Giles also says sometimes the only way to escape the horrors of war is to run from one's home, and women's responsibility for dependent children and the elderly often creates a special urgency to flee as quickly as possible, even while it hampers such flight. Because of our traditional roles as caretakers, women are caught in a double bind, and they want to bring their families to safety, but because they're taking responsibility for so many more people, that makes their flight that much more difficult. There's also a lack of resources for women. A 2000 study by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees revealed that many UNHCR staff were not including sanitary supplies in relief packages given to female refugees. That's something those of us in the room who are assigned female at birth take for granted. That's something we can easily pick up at the corner store, but when you're displaced, when you're in a camp, it's so important to have those things, and it's a dignity issue, really. It took a lot of effort from women's advocates, both within and outside the UN, to change that and make sure these women have the supplies they needed. War also makes women more vulnerable to domestic violence. For example, after the Dayton Peace Agreement ended the war in the former Yugoslavia, there were women's organizations in Serbia and Croatia that reported an increase in domestic violence against women carried out by demobilized soldiers and paramilitaries. The local term was 9 p.m. violence because the attacks followed the 9 p.m. news. Women's organizations in sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific region, and Latin and Central America have also recorded similar patterns of domestic violence. Ann Jones, journalist and photographer, and also herself the daughter of a World War I veteran who never really came home from the war, says in her 2010 book, "War is not over when it's over. Women speak out from the ruins of war. The violence of war does not end when peace is declared. Often it merely recedes from public to private life." And while it's true that women are often empowered in times of war by becoming the head of household or responsible for the entire family income, they also lose economic opportunities and educational opportunities very frequently. Ruth Jacobson, former lecturer at the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, writes, "There's substantial evidence of significant forces serving to marginalize or even disempower the women who have sustained the socioeconomic fabric of their communities during the conflict. Anne Jones, again, writes about post-conflict Côte d'Ivoire after their conflicts in the 1990s. Here was the perfect political economy, gender-based servitude. Women labored, men profited. Even after war is over, women are typically forgotten in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration efforts, also known as DDR. Most DDR programs focus on adult males who have served in active combat, and this tends to exclude women, girls, and to a lesser extent boys who have primarily served in auxiliary functions that have provided the backbone for the fighting forces. That's from Linda Ackerbaum-Cole, Executive Director of African Women Rising. Think about being a veteran and after your service going to the VA, either in the federal building or the Lewis Stokes Medical Center for benefits, and being turned down because you're female. And this happens. Only 15 to 20% of U.S. military personnel actually engage in active combat, but most people would find it shocking if the remaining 80 to 85% were not granted the recognition and status of being considered members of the U.S. military. And one of the most horrifying effects that war has on women and girls is rape and military sexual trauma. Dr. Carrie Crawford, Associate Professor of Political Science at James Madison University, writes, "The seeming ubiquity of sexual violence in war cemented its perception as an inevitable aspect of armed conflict and cast sexual violence both as taboo and as commonplace, stifling effective political and legal discussion and action." Here's a sampling of statistics. These are complicated by the fact that the records were not necessarily accurate, and also by the fact that, as in civilian settings, survivors typically do not report. For example, during the World War II invasion of Nanjing in China in 1937, there were an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 victims and survivors. The Comfort Women system that was implemented by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II claims 50,000 to 410,000, and most of these women never received reparations. In post-World War II Berlin, Soviet soldiers raped and sexually assaulted 100,000 to 1 million women and girls. In Bangladesh during the conflict in 1971, and there were 200,000 victims and survivors. In Sierra Leone during their war from 1991 to 2002, anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000. In Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1991 to 1993, 20,000 to 60,000. Rwanda in 1994, 250,000 to 500,000. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo from 2006 to 2007, more than 400,000. Wartime conflict-related sexual violence includes both systematic or strategic and opportunistic. Systematic or strategic sexual violence directly serves the interests of an armed group or the state. Examples include mass rape as a tool of ethnic cleansing. Opportunistic sexual violence includes cases of conflict zone prostitution and other forms of sexual exploitation, including human trafficking. Who's familiar with Blackwater? Yeah. Well, they've been implicated in trafficking women from other countries into Iraq to work in the sex industry. They promised the women beautician jobs in Dubai and then kidnapped them and smuggled them into Iraq. Blackwater employees also have a history of sexually abusing Iraqi women and children, all subsidized through U.S. taxpayer dollars. And some consequences of wartime sexual violence include, and I'll refrain from the details because I know some people are eating, uterine prolapse, HIV, other STIs, obstetric fistulas, miscarriages, and post-traumatic stress disorder. It took until 2008 for the UN to recognize sexual violence as a war crime in UN Security Council Resolution 1820. Sexual violence, when used or commissioned as a tactic of war in order to deliberately target civilians, or as a part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilian populations, can significantly exacerbate said situations of armed conflict. Seems self-evident, but it took them that long to demand the immediate and complete cessation by all parties to armed conflict of all acts of sexual violence against civilians with immediate effect. Notes that the resolution notes that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. Cheryl Bernard, who was wife of Zalmay Khalilzad, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, worked on Resolution 1820. She says it would not have passed if it had not focused on sexual violence as a tactic of war. There are many grave issues in the world, and the UN Security Council cannot take them all on. This was followed up by Resolution 1888, which established the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. Then Resolution 1960 tasked the Secretary General to produce an annual report documenting the prevalence of sexual violence in wartime and the perpetrators who commit it. And in June of 2013, Resolution 2106 recognized that perpetrators also target men and boys, and that sexual violence is linked to concerns about gender equality and women's human rights. There's also the problem of military sexual trauma. The Department of Veterans Affairs defines military sexual trauma, or MST, as experiences of sexual assault or repeated threatening sexual harassment that a veteran experiences during his or her military service. The VA screens all veterans receiving services for MST, and the data indicates that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 100 men have experienced MST. And once again, survivors typically do not report. MST is the leading cause of PTSD among female veterans, but men receive higher disability compensation ratings for PTSD related to MST. Thank you. The VA spends approximately $10,880 on healthcare costs per MST survivor. Women have a long history of participating in war, either in state forces or in non-state armed groups. Diane Mazurana, who is research professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, writes, "Some of the earliest evidence of women's participation in armed conflict comes from the Celts and ancient Romans, and historic accounts of girls' active participation goes back at least as far as the 5th century. In 2018, women represented 16% of the U.S. enlisted forces and 18% of the officer corps. As proof that this is an intersectional issue, 56% of female enlisted recruits are Latinx or Hispanic or a member of a racial minority or both. The statistic is from the Council on Foreign Relations. The majority of countries permit women to serve in the military, with at least 16 industrialized nations permitting women to serve in frontline or combat roles. There are a few countries that either conscript women or have compulsory military service for women, and these include Armenia, Bolivia, Cape Verde, Chad, China, Eritrea, Israel, Norway, North Korea, and Sweden. In the National Geographic November 2019 issue, Lindsay Adario says, "Their uniforms and circumstances differ, but they cite similar reasons for joining armed forces. They want to show confidence, competence, and strength, setting an example for their children while proving something to themselves. Some mention a larger purpose that their male counterparts do not. They want to make life better for women and girls in their country, the region, and in the world." Women also join for very pragmatic reasons. Jennifer G. Mathers, senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University and former editor of Minerva Journal of Women in War, writes, in many instances in both rich and poor nations, women's primary motivation for joining the armed forces is economic. When women have limited economic options, they join the armed forces for pay, status, training, education, and basic needs that they might not be able to get otherwise. In 2010, the first female engagement teams deployed to Afghanistan. A similar program in Iraq started before that, called the Lioness Program. Robin Lee Riley writes, their job is to accompany male infantry units on patrol so that they can engage with Afghan women. American women are being asked to reinscribe the gender division of labor by doing in a war zone what is traditionally women's work, engaging in social duties and interacting with children. It's true that this honors local customs, but it potentially creates a false sense of security as well. Marine Second Lieutenant Carly E. Towers in the Department of Defense story about female engagement teams says, our mission out here is to talk to and work with the locals to build cooperation and security. Female service members are also used to search other women for weapons and other contraband. Again, this honors local customs, but is also a violation of a woman's bodily rights. Yeah, women have a long history in both formal peace processes and in anti-war activism. The examples I'm providing are mostly from the 20th and 21st century. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founded in 1915 and by 1,300 women from Europe and North America, now has sections worldwide. Its UN office played a key role in the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, adopted on October 31st, 2000. Resolution 1325 affirms the role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in peace building, and stresses the importance of their equal participation and full involvement. And they also reaffirm the need to implement fully international humanitarian and human rights law that protects the rights of women and girls during and after conflicts. The Women in Black started in Israel in 1987 as a group of women protesting Israel's military occupation of the West Bank. The International Women's Network Against Militarism is made up of individuals and organizations from South Korea, the Philippines, Okinawa, Japan, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, and the continental United States. They organize against the harmful effects of U.S. bases, military budgets, and military operations. One of the longest lasting peace demonstrations was the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. They started holding vigil at Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires in front of the Casa Rosada presidential palace in 1977, eventually holding vigils every Thursday afternoon. The women wore white headscarves symbolizing diapers and embroidered with the names and dates of birth of their children who disappeared during the Dirty War from 1977 to 1983. The Committee of Soldiers' Mothers of Russia first started campaigning for their sons to come home early from military service to finish their studies, Russia being one of the countries that conscripts. They succeeded in bringing home 180,000 young men. They later expanded their aims to addressing conditions in the armed forces, then negotiating with the Chechen army during the war in Chechnya in the mid-90s. They also publicized the impact of human rights abuses by Russian forces and their impact on Chechen women. Maria Liberakina, former head of the Feminist Research Department at the Russian Institute for Cultural Research, writes, the hero's mother rhetoric did not leave space for natural human feelings of sorrow, grief, or anger. Now that women are free to publicly express these emotions, they have used this power to push the anti-war movement from its early narrow focus on maternal rights to a broad call for human rights. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Women's Strike for Peace. They brought baby carriages into Congress during the 1960s as part of their campaign against above-ground nuclear weapons testing, which resulted in strontium-90 being found in human breast milk and cow's milk. The Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Commons started with 36 women and a few men and children who walked from Cardiff to Greenham Common Air Base, 120 miles, to protest the arrival of 96 American Tomahawk cruise missiles. Eventually, 35,000 women were mobilized to surround the 9 miles of wire around the camp. They also scaled the fence and climbed one of the missile silos. Women have also participated in more formal peace processes. In Somalia in 2000, participation in peace talks was restricted to the men of Somalia's 5 clans. So a cross-clan group of women peace activists led by Asha Havi Almi called themselves the 6th Clan, the Clan of Women, and camped outside the location of the talks. They eventually managed to negotiate a gender quota for the transitional federal parliament seats and the establishment of a women's ministry. In Northern Ireland in 1998, Monica McWilliams, who is a Catholic feminist academic from South Belfast, and Pearl Sager, a Protestant social worker from East Belfast, formed the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. They lobbied political parties to include women on their candidate lists and then formed their own political party. They managed to secure 2 seats in the Northern Ireland National Assembly and were able to participate in the Good Friday Agreement that helped de-escalate the violence in Northern Ireland. In the Philippines in 2003, when the Moro Islamic Revolutionary Front's main camp was bombed by the Philippine government and they withdrew from peace talks, the Mothers for Peace used an ad to urge the militants back to the negotiating table. They used a song with the lyrics, "First our husbands, next our brothers, now our sons," and ended with, "Who else will stand up for peace in Mindanao?" In Manipur, India in the 2000s, members of the All Manipur Social Reformation and Development Samaj responded to the rape of a young Manipuri girl by the Indian Army by stripping in front of Army headquarters and demanding that they all be raped because they were all mothers of the girl who was raped. In Guatemala in 2009 and 2010, when the National Congress passed a law censoring violence against women, a coalition of women's groups pushed for more reform and organized a tribunal of consciousness focused on sexual crimes committed by the Guatemalan army during the Civil War, especially against Mayan women. I'll leave you with a quote from Lysistrata by Aristophanes. It was first performed in classical Athens in 411 BC, and is about a woman's efforts to end the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta by denying sex to the men of the warring city-states. Her name is from the Attic Greek for army disbander. What matters that I was born a woman if I can cure your misfortunes? I pay my share of tolls and taxes by giving men to the state. But you miserable graybeards, you contribute nothing to the public charges. On the contrary, you have wasted the treasure of our forefathers, as it was called, the treasure amassed in the days of the Persian Wars. You pay nothing at all in return, and into the bargain you endanger our lives and liberties by your mistakes. Any questions? Yes.
Yes, are there any international women's groups working for nonviolence and gender equity?
There are a lot of them. The women, hang on, the first group that I mentioned that started during World War I is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has chapters worldwide. They started just in Europe and North America. But they have gone global, and they actually have an office at the UN. That's just the first example I can think of. I'm sure there would be others, and I would be happy to do some research and email you a list if you like.
Women Speak Out for Peace and Justice?
Yes, Women Speak Out for Peace and Justice, absolutely.
Is that international?
It is.
This isn't a question. This is just a little bit of information that I have a friend who worked for Planned Parenthood in New York. She came to Cleveland and she had looked up online that we have this museum at Case, and I didn't know about it. It's about women's